So if you want to, we could now go a little bit into the is-ought dichotomy, because I think that was very fascinating that you brought this up.
Yes, sure. That's a very interesting subject. So it seems to me that this is-ought dilemma is used as a very huge argument against the idea of objective morality, because we can't ground it in anything, because we can only see things as they are, not how they ought to be, and therefore we can never arrive at an ought, or at least not from is's, to put it that way. And yes, I would say that no, we can see oughts, the idea that things ought to be a certain way, is very naturally flowing from things' essences and purposes. Because when you think about things having certain natural ends, it makes much sense to just say that they are supposed to be a certain way. A heart is supposed to pump blood, a nose is supposed to smell things. And water is supposed to flow, or at least equalize levels across an area, or how you would formulate that. And a tree is supposed to grow and bear fruit if it's according to its nature, etc. And you could thus say that, yes, they ought to follow their essence. They ought to accomplish their natural ends, because that makes perfect sense, because that's what they are. This essence is in the thing, and it's supposed to be that according to its essence. So, so in other words, oughts are derived from things having teleological ends. So you could therefore derive an ought from an is in that sense, in that the oughts are implied or implicit in the fact that things have natural ends. So yeah, that's one way I could formulate an answer to that dilemma.
Yes, I think that's very interesting. And I never made this connection so far, that that if you say that things have certain natural ends, then you can say that you can derive the ought from the is, because something has a nature and it has the natural aim, especially because this is often used in the context of human morality or of ethics. So you can say human beings have a nature, and therefore certain ways of behavior are conducive to actualizing your nature, or becoming more like that which we conceptualize as the essence or the nature of a human being. And then these ways of acting would be good, and ways that move away from it would be bad. Now, I have two interesting thoughts that came to my mind when you talked about this before. The first point was, even if I grant this, what you have said, sometimes it might still be that we do not know which way would now be the good way to act. So, for example, if I'm standing here and I'm thinking, okay, so I can either, I don't know, I can either kill this horse and eat it, or I can walk in this direction and try to find, I don't know, some plants that I can eat. Now, which of these things should I do? It's not just the existence of the horse and of the world around me doesn't tell me if I should now kill the horse and eat it, or walk in this direction, or do any other thing.
Right. I would say that you could have choices like the examples that in the example you gave, in which both options are acceptable and both are according to human nature. Just as a more everyday example, people have to make choices about what to eat to dinner this day. Should I perhaps eat chicken, or should I eat fish, or something else? And when they make these choices, many times both options, or all the options in front of them, are perfectly acceptable. But then, okay, perhaps they choose one over the other because of preferences, or because they feel a certain way that specific day, which lead them toward that instead of the other thing. And both of them could be acceptable according to human nature. So yes, not all choices involve a choice between the moral and the immoral, I would say. So that's a brief answer I would give to that.
Yes. Sorry, just taking a note. Yes, I think that's a very good point. And it reminds me of this conversation we had about rights, where you said that a right can be understood also as a moral shield. And I wasn't exactly sure at the time how to understand it, but I think this example shows this very nicely. That, for example, as a human being, you have the right to eat things which are, I mean, and now not the right in the social or legal sense, but in the moral sense, you have the right to eat things which are conducive to keeping you alive and functioning. And inside of this prescribed area of behavior, you can now choose in whatever way you want. So you can either eat this or you can eat that. You can eat it now or later, or maybe in small portions or big portions. These are all choices that they are not in that sense moral choices, but they are different options which are both in accordance with the nature of the thing. But what you shouldn't do is, for example, eat sand or eat a piece of wood or eat arsenic or something which is poisonous, because that then would not be in accordance with your nature. And so therefore, and I think this is exactly the second thought that went through my mind as you were talking. In many instances, there might be 10 or 20 or a couple of ways in which something can be good, but there will be many more ways in which it can be not good. So even if the number of good choices is not 1, but perhaps 10, there are still a million bad choices or ways in which something could be bad.
Yes, exactly. And as you pointed out, the standard will be whether something is good or bad according to our nature. And one example for a choice which would be immoral and could be shown to be immoral, would say lie to your local community. As you pointed out, human beings are by nature social animals, so it's according to our nature to fulfill the role of being good men in social contexts whenever we are in a social context. And of course, all social interaction which are good for human beings imply trust, that you trust each other. That's a very important foundation to live in a society, to live in a community, as well within a family, a neighborhood, all kinds of interactions. And lying attacks trust. It destroys trust by its very essence. So if you do that, you undermine a principle that is necessary to fulfill your role, your sociality, whenever you are in a community or a social context. So that is an application of those principles we have just been talking about to a specific issue like lying.
Yes, interesting, interesting. Now, I have just a thought to this example that you made, because there is this famous philosophical debate. If the Nazis come ringing at your door and ask, do you have any Jews hidden in your house? Should you lie to them or should you tell the truth? And I tend to believe that in such circumstances, it would be actually moral to lie. And it would be, I'm not sure if I would say immoral to tell the truth, but it would at certainly be better to lie in that case. And I think the reason for it is that the sociality or the trust inside of the community that you have talked about has already completely broken down. So you are not in that scenario in a situation where you and your community have a basis of trust, but you are actually in a hostile environment where other people are posing a danger to you and might kill you. And so therefore it's a different scenario. So just a brief side note, but what do you think of that?
Yeah, that's an old ethical dilemma, it seems to me, that this scenario we bring forward. And yes, I'm not sure how to satisfaction or to answer it with complete satisfaction. But I suppose it could be said that since trust is the principle of all communal and social life, it seems, and I'm not sure if I can sort of articulate fully why yet, but it seems to me that to the basis of exceptions where you have certain social agencies being dangerous could not justify undermining a general principle behind social life in general. Now, I will also provide another argument for why lying is wrong, which I also think is very relevant here, and that is that to lie contradicts the very nature of communication. So whenever you communicate to someone, the very act of communicating is to use the means of language and your faculty of reason and your voice to present truths to the person you're talking to. That is within the purpose or essence of communication. So communication is a part of, it's natural for human beings. The faculty of communication is a part of human nature, or at least attributable to human nature. So if you lie, you abuse a faculty proper to your nature. You abuse something which contradicts the purpose of what you're supposed to do. So I would say that lying is wrong in a more intrinsic sense, in addition to being wrong according to this social thing, according to undermining a principle of social life. So yes, I would say those things. And yes, and also going back to my first response, it has something to do with creating. The thing is, even in hostile environments, it seems to me you're still living in society, and the social life is still a part of your life, even though it's severely weakened. And you should still sort of obey the principles of that social life to the extent that social life exists. And even in a hostile environment, social life exists to a certain degree, and to the extent it exists, you still have to follow the principles which built that social life. So again, I'm not sure if I can fully answer this dilemma you posted with satisfaction, but those are at least my thoughts.
No, I mean, I think I understand your thoughts, and also I think it's not a question where you can just easily kind of give an answer, because there are different aspects that can be weighed differently, and therefore you might reach a different conclusion. Also, I think it's more just a side note which just came into my mind, as you said, that it's immoral to lie to your community, and I would agree to this statement. But as we said, in other contexts, certain things or certain concepts presuppose many other things. And so for me to call these human beings with which I interact my local community, or to speak of a principle of sociality, this implies many things. And one of the things which it implies is that these other people also have my own well-being in mind, and for example, won't kill me. And so if this presupposition is not granted, then it seems to me that I can't really speak of my local community or the principle of sociality, and therefore the rule that you shouldn't lie to your community would then also not really apply anymore in my understanding.
Well, I just had this thought, but now I just forgot it.
Oh no.
Very well. But there was another point, at least, and that is that whenever you're confronted with such a scenario, it's not necessary. You don't have to necessarily choose between either lying or telling the truth. You could just stay silent and refuse to say anything whatsoever. Though the Nazis would not necessarily accept that, but at least that's a third option. That is not immoral, I would say. And yes, when it comes to social life and its value for human beings, I think social life inherently is good, and you could say that other human beings being within your social life at least have the capacity to do good to you. There's always the capacity in that social life, even if they fail to actualize those in a specific circumstance. At least they have the capacity to promote that. And I would also, yes, now I remember my first point. I would also emphasize the point that the ends do not justify the means. I would say that to use immoral means will always be unjustified because of the immorality of those means, that ends cannot justify things which are inherently contrary to human nature or contrary to principles derived from human nature. So I would also point out that it wouldn't be right to say that lying is in itself wrong, but it can be accepted if it is to preserve a good basically, like some Jews hiding in the basement. So I will also emphasize that point, that the ends do not justify the means, and perhaps we could talk more about that principle as well. But yeah.
Yes, that would be perhaps even a topic for its own separate discussion.
Yes.
The ends not justifying the means, because that's a big and interesting question in itself. There's one more thing I wanted to say about the is-ought dichotomy, and that is many people also when they use this is-ought dichotomy argument, they have such things in mind as culture, for example. So they say, well, for example, here in Switzerland or here in Europe, we do things in this or that manner. For example, we have a democracy to make certain social decisions. But for example, in Australia, the Aborigines, they used to have this system based on different totem animals, and different people belonged to different groups, and the groups were organized according to their totem, and they have a completely different form of social organization. But if you look at the human being, there is this material that you see, or the human beings that you see, doesn't tell you how you ought to organize society. So yeah, why is now this form of organization or religion or any better than this other one if you can't really see it, you can't really describe or derive it from just the observation of the world? So what would you say to that argument?
Right. So I would perhaps formulate that question which you asked in a more general way, that how do we examine all necessary aspects of human nature when we consider morality? And I would say there are different levels of understanding or having knowledge about human nature. And one is the knowing about human nature from a purely biological standpoint, like biologists or doctors do, physiologists, who just look at the human body and see, okay, what do we need for survival? What do we need in order to survive? Well, we need food and nutrition and things like that. So that's one part of human nature, which can be considered in itself. And then you have other parts, like I'd like to mention, because there are higher parts like social life, political life, those cannot be examined purely from a biological standpoint, simply by looking at the body, because that has more to do with our higher part, you could say, the soul of human being, our needs that are social and which concern our interaction with others. And I would say we can know about those aspects of human nature as well by observing how human beings interact with each other in society. Also, to study history can be useful, that, and study societies around the world to see what they do and why they do what they do. Personal experience, you can know yourself whether you feel that you need this or that, and you can compare it to other human beings. And I would also say that you can also use economics to help you out there. For instance, you can think that, okay, human beings, they need not only to or I would put it this way, that certain needs for human beings require cooperation within a larger framework within a society. You cannot do absolutely everything on your own. You cannot sustain your own life all by yourself. You need, for instance, a family. When you grow up, you need a family, and you need help from that family later in life also, generally speaking, like, for instance, help with making good life decisions. And you also, people generally enjoy being with family. And also for producing food and shelter and other things, generally speaking, to have a good life in that sense, you need cooperation with other human beings. You need transaction, you need division of labor, and all those things. So we see the need for society right there. And from there, we can argue that, okay, society also needs trust, it needs division of labor, as I explained, it needs the family, and we also see that families relate to each other in certain ways. And of course, as we've been talking about for a long time, common goods exist in society, and someone has to take care of those common goods. And therefore, we see the need for authority and government, etc. But okay, then we have different forms of government. Okay, we examine those which are best according when it comes to governance. So I would say we have all these different principles and ways of examining human nature that we can use to find out how human beings should organize socially, for instance.
Yes, I think you pointed out many very important considerations to this question. And one thing that I'm thinking, which we said before when it was a more simple question about what should you eat, we said, well, there might be more than one solution that works, but there are many more solutions that don't work or that are not good. And so you can still derive what ought to be from what is, or speaking, you can derive how you should behave from your nature, but there might be more than one option. But still, there are many options which are not good and which are kind of excluded. And the same could be also in a more complex sense for social organization, because many of these things that you have mentioned, they kind of depend on each other. So the which form of government works well, that depends also on the customs and habits and ways of interacting that are accepted or just common in a certain culture. So for example, a democracy can work well if most people most of the time try to consider not only what is good for themselves, but also what is good for the society at large. But it will not function if everybody all of the time only thinks of what is good for themselves. And also, you could say that even a monarchy or a tyranny or just a government where one person says what is going to happen and all the others do what they are told, it might function well if most people most of the time think of fulfilling their role in their society as good as they can, and not just being very resentful that someone is telling them what they have to do. And also, of course, the person in charge at the top has to consider what is good for everybody and not just what is good for themselves. And so what I'm trying to get at is that there might be more than one configuration of social coexistence for human beings that might work and might be in accordance with human nature, in that it satisfies all the relevant criteria that make a human being. But there are certainly many more forms of social interaction that don't satisfy these criteria than there are ways that work.
Right, and when we look at Aristotle and St. Thomas Aquinas, what they do is that they examine different forms of government. They categorize it in 3 categories: monarchy, ruled by one, that is, an aristocracy, which is ruled by a few, and then democracy, which is ruled by many, or by the people. And they examine that there are good and bad versions of each. The bad version of monarchy is tyranny, and aristocracy, the bad version of that is oligarchy. And well, actually they call democracy the bad version, and polity or something like that, like the good version of democracy in a sense. And I think they would agree with what you say, that all of those forms of government can work and can be good, but they would perhaps say that some of them are better than others. Some of them are better at, for instance, preventing corruption than others. That some of these forms of government are better at organizing authority in efficient ways than others. So you can, in a sense, have different forms of government or social organization, all of which are workable and can be good, but some of them are more practical, they are more feasible and better than others in when we have practical considerations and things like that. So this can also be true of other things which are relevant to politics, like taxation. What level of taxation should be in that society? There are different considerations to take into account. So yes, that's something that people can discuss, and different arguments and considerations. But ultimately, human nature is what everyone has to keep in mind.
Yes, and I think that's a good end word for this part of our conversation. That yes, there might be certain questions where you can choose freely between different alternatives, or where there is a continuum of possibilities and it's not exactly clear how you ought to decide in this situation. But that doesn't mean that there is absolutely never a situation or a question where you can say how something ought to be based from how it is, which is this is-ought dichotomy. So I really learned something here, that you can derive from the nature of something the spectrum of good possibilities, and inside of these you can perhaps choose freely or discuss or have different options, but still the spectrum is somehow limited by the nature of the thing itself. So I think that's great.
Right, and also briefly to say that as well, within those options which are acceptable to human nature, you can argue that some are better than the other good ones according to human nature. Some would say that certain meals or choices for what you eat for dinner are better than others, even though both options can be good. So yeah, that was also a way you could formulate this principle that we were talking about.